Welcome to class time. Today we start with Cape Caribbean Studies, then we jump over to CSEC Agricultural Science and back to Cape with Biology. I'm Melissa Beckford Simpson, your Cape Caribbean Studies teacher for today. Let's get started. Okay, so for today's lesson, we are going to be looking at Caribbean society and culture, but more specifically, stratification. So we're going to understand the factors that have contributed to social stratification in the Caribbean. What are our objectives? We want to say what we mean by social stratification. We want to examine the terms associated with social stratification. We want to discuss the theories, yes. We want to determine the extent to which Caribbean society is characterized by the plantation, as we will discuss later. And then, of course, at the very end, we want to learn how to construct proper essays and master multiple choice questions. Let's get right into it. So let us remind ourselves, first of all, what is a society? Now, these are the factors that make up a society. A group of people who have a shared common purpose, who live within a defined territorial space, geographical space. There is continuity over time and space, and there is citizenship within this space. So less than that, we don't have a society. You may have nomadic groups of people who move around, but unless you have all of these elements, we don't actually have a society. So first we have to know what a society is in order to understand how the society is then stratified. All right, so then what is social stratification? It is the division of the society into groups or strata. An alternative definition, a system of inequality where persons are ranked based on predetermined factors, and this may vary from society to society. And we look at this. It implies that at least one group has more of what is valued by that society. And you may ask, why do I say by that society? Because values, we have already looked at values. Values change, or values are different. They are relative to societies. And some of these things include money, power, and prestige. And we're going to locate social stratification within the Caribbean, which is why we use these examples. But for other societies, other things could be very much more valuable than these things. All right? Now, stratification is as old as society itself. So, for as long as we can recall any kind of society, there has been stratification. And when we look at these ancient and medieval societies, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, and feudalist Europe, then we understand. And usually, when we talk about stratified society, we are using a pyramid to demonstrate. No, never mind my pyramid. But we are using a pyramid to demonstrate, right? And so there's usually a large group at the bottom somewhere here, most times, because it represents the majority of the society. And then there's usually a very tiny group at the top, the elite. So when you look at any of these societies, and perhaps you would have done some of them already in, second form or so, where you looked at ancient Egypt, for example, or ancient Mesopotamia, there was always some kind of structuring. There's always the idea that there are different groupings in a society based on whatever it is that the society values, and that these different groupings are, more or less important or less important according to how you look at it. But there's always this huge base for the pyramid right at the bottom where the majority of the people are. And we're going to find out why this is so. Now, we have two different types of systems of stratification. The first is an open system. And I choose to look at the open system first, because there are a number of things that we can jump off when we're talking about Caribbean stratification as it relates to the other system, which is, of course, a closed system. So we talk about an open system. We're saying that persons from different strata have an opportunity to move up or move across, depending on how you're looking at it. So persons can actually move up or down or across based on a predetermined set of factors of that society. All right? Usually this system is not structured, based on race or religion, because those are things you don't generally change, especially when you're talking about race. You can't change your race. If you're black, you're black. You can't change that. And so we're not necessarily talking about systems based on race or religion, because those things tend to divide people very much. And then in the Caribbean society, though, education may be the most important determining factor, although there are other factors too. All right, we're going to examine some of these factors. And this system is usually considered a class system. Please note the terminology that we're using as it relates to stratification, because in your writing, you will have to reproduce these same kinds of terminology. All right, so let's look at this open stratification system. One bright spark somewhere in your living room should be able to tell me which system this is representing. Because we have, in fact, looked at the different groupings of people in the Caribbean before. So you must be able to tell me, man. We have at the top the Ubuntu. Think about it. All right. Now, we are, in fact, referring to the Kalinago social structure. Yes, the indigenous peoples also had a social structure, albeit not quite the same as ours today, but they did. All right? Now, their system was very communal in terms of how they operated, right? And then when you're looking at the Taina too, even more so. But most importantly, we want to look at these terms. It was a meritocratic system, and status was achieved. We know what the word achieved means, right? It means you have to work for it. Same thing for meritocratic. You don't just get something. You have to earn it. You have to work for it. Let's look at an example. The Kalinago system of choosing a leader. Very good example of how meritocracy comes in. And when you talk about an ASI or a crasy, you're talking about a system, usually a kind of political system or social system. So, for the Kalinago society, it's very interesting what they do. So, first thing you need to know is that at the very beginning, once the boys are born, they are weaned as quickly as they can from their mothers. And then they're taken away, because boys must not grow with women, because women were too soft, you know. They could not give them the kind of prowess and bravery that they needed to be taught. So they had to be taken away from the mothers, and then they would go live with the men. And the men and the women lived differently, separately. So from the child is weaned, this boy, he begins to be trained like a warrior. He has to learn to think like a warrior. You remember the text, the young warriors? Even though that refers to the Maroons, it's a similar kind of ideology or idea. They are taken away and then they are trained how to be tough, how to be brave and strong and courageous. And then now, when he becomes of age, then he has to pass certain tests in order to become a warrior. Because in the Kalinago society, you see, being a warrior was everything. That was what it was all about, you know? And so he had to now pass certain tests in order to become a warrior. What did he have to do? A number of things that are pretty gruesome. So one of the things that we have read about is that they had to, for example, take in a number of Taina heads, you know, so when they go out to war to fight, then they would have to prove themselves by taking in. And if they could take in the head of a Taina chief, much better, right? And so this is how one becomes a warrior. But let's look at it a little bit more. In the Kalinago society, the existing leader can be threatened at any time by anybody who feels himself up to the task, up to the time, right? And so this individual can then decide that he wants to threaten or he wants to come forward for the position of the Ubuntu. And if he is successful, then the existing Ubuntu booted out and, you know, sent away or whatever in shame, because it was always about prowess. And it was, in fact, very much meritocratic. So if you didn't earn it, if you couldn't pass the test to become a warrior, then what do you become? You become a religious leader, because you didn't cut it to become a warrior. And that is what that society was about. And so you see what I mean by it depends on the society that we're talking about, right? So that is the example of a meritocratic social structure. And then the Obutu goes to the top, right, more or less. And then he has some village headmen below him. And then the majority of the population, of course, the women come all the way down the bottom because of how women were classified in that society. Now let's look at the closed system and define. So if we said the open means that you can move up or down or across, it means for the closed that there is no movement. Little, very, very little, or no movement in this kind of system. All right? And it says that there is inequality in the system. Obviously, once you have a stratified society, then there is inequality. But even more so in a closed system, because the individuals of that society do not have an opportunity to move from where they are, right? And so it is usually structured based on race or religion. And as we said, of course, if you're black, you're just black, unless you're going to do other things to make yourself look brown. Right? But if when you do that, you notice the knuckles don't usually come clean. So it still tell you, say you're black. So you can try, but you're still black. And so what happens is that you cannot change your race, and therefore you are not able to change your position on the social structure. All right? So what am I talking about? What exactly am I talking about? I am talking about the plantation structure. So examine this pyramid for a little while, right? It's looking much better than the one I drew. And we are seeing a general structure here, very general structure. Of course, the blacks who are enslaved are at the bottom, and that base is wide, as you can see there. And then you have colored or mulatto in the middle. And in some cases, there are free blacks there too, in the very rare case that they are actually able to buy their freedom. And at the very top, you have the whites. Now, this is precisely a system that is based on race. And this was a closed system because you could not move from where you were just like that. And remember I said little or no, because there were cases in which, such as in Haiti, and I know you're going, Lord, this is a teacher, I love Haiti. Every time she references, it's Haiti she referencing. Well, because it has the right examples. In Haiti, for example, just before the revolution, there were a number of free blacks and a number of mulattoes who were rich and who owned plantations and so on. But they could not be at the top because they were not white. You understand? And so this is what we pay attention to when we are looking at this structure. So let's look at this one here now. There's a further divisioning. So we had originally just blacks at the bottom, mulattoes and free blacks, and then whites. But there's a further divisioning of this structure. Let's look at it. Two different groupings at the very bottom, and then another grouping of blacks. So we have field slaves or predials at the bottom, and then there's a further divisioning of the field slaves. So we have first gang, second gang, third gang. You guess what could be in this gang. So the first gang is the strongest grouping, male and female. Second gang would be next in line, and the third gang we call the picnic gang or the hog meat gang. You guess why we say that. The riffraff goes into that gang. So if you lose a hand or a foot, or the very small children or very old, go into that gang. And then above the field slaves, we have domestics and skilled slaves. Domestics first and then skilled slaves at the top. So we're talking about the coopers and the blacksmiths and so on. And then the free blacks, who are below the mulattoes in a sense. And then in the white division, we have another divisioning. So at the very top of the whites, you have the plantation owners, his wife, Sometimes the plantation owners were absent, absentee plantation owners, but you have his attorney who is in charge of the plantation, who lives in the great house. Then below that, there are the bookkeepers and the overseers and so on. And then you have a group of poor whites who don't own any property and who are also menially employed on the plantation. So there's a further divisioning on this plantation system. And believe me, it was very, very, very rigid. Now, we talked about the people who came across to the Caribbean. And so all of these people at some point contribute to what we call the social structure of the Caribbean, both in the past and in the present. All right? We don't need to go through all of them. The indigenous peoples and the Europeans, the Africans, and after enslavement, the East Indians and so on. All right? And we went into indentureship for the East Indians. Now, why are we looking at the people who came as a part of social stratification and as a part of the Caribbean system? It's because we're looking at the plantation as a feature, right? And in some ways, as we're going to discuss, the feature called the plantation still has a lot to do with the political, the economic, and the social systems of the Caribbean. So under the plantation system, there's a small number of whites who are the owners and the employers, right? The employers, a large number of blacks who are the enslaved laborers, a mixed group in the middle, and this is fixed based on whiteness or blackness. And notice these terms that I'm using, whiteness or blackness, because it depends a lot on the shade of your skin. And we're going to discuss that a little bit more, the shade of your skin. Let's compare the plantation system to the Indian caste system, which is another closed system of stratification. So this is the Indian caste system. Now, this one is not based on race because it is a society where all the people are the same race, but it's predominantly based on religious beliefs, right? So if you belong to the untouchables at the bottom here, the outcasts of the society, there is no way that you could actually become a part of any other group. So here are the features of the Indian caste. Ascribed status, which means that you attain it at birth, right? You cannot work for it. There's nothing you can do to achieve it. It's a closed system based on race, not based on race, I beg your pardon. Marriage outside of the caste is prohibited, so you have to intermarry within whichever caste you fall. Right? Wealth, level of education, power, prestige is determined by the strata to which one belongs. So if you're bad-lucked, as we'd say in Jamaica, bad-lucked enough to be born in the untouchables, we would say what? Dog nyam your supper. Now, modern Caribbean stratified system. Why do I say this? Because we still have a stratified system. It may not be caste or closed, but we still have a stratified system. What do we call this one? We call this a class-based system, all right? So you have the lower class there, may not be 8% or the percentages you see exactly, but the general idea, lower class, working class. And you notice the difference between those two, lower middle class, upper middle class, and upper class. All right? And even within the upper class, you could have further layers and further divisions of that same society. Right? So we're seeing a modern stratified system. Now, what are the features? It is meritocratic. We already said it is a system of class, but it is also meritocratic, which means you have to earn it, much like, well, not precisely like how you would earn it in the Kalinago system, but you still have to earn it. You have to do something, all right? You achieve status. It's not necessarily the status you are born in, although we could argue that somewhat. Yes, that's debatable. Education is seen as the main means of upward social mobility. And then you have this group of people we call the intelligentsia. Yes, those people who have higher education and who are grouped. So it doesn't matter if you're poor, or how much pay you're taking home per month, and I'm clearing my throat here as it relates to teachers because we are classified in the intelligentsia, but we don't want to go down that road. And then we have marriage, acquisition of wealth, or entrepreneurship. So what do I mean here? I'm talking about persons who have acquired wealth, not necessarily through education. So we have a lot of athletes, and we have a lot of people in media and in what you call it now, music, because, you know, it's what we commercialize in Jamaica. And so these persons become a part of, you know, the upper class because of some acquisition of wealth, not necessarily through education. And we mentioned this term social mobility, but we need to talk about it just a little bit more because it is crucial to an understanding of social stratification in the Caribbean. And we would have defined it in all of our, you know, going on so far. The extent to which individuals are able to move amongst social classes. The extent to which. So you look at a society and you determine, is social mobility something that is readily done or is easy in that society, or is it something that, you know, is very, very difficult? The extent to which it is done. Movement can be upward, downward, or lateral. How can it be downward? I think we know how it can be upward, but how can it be downward? If you lose your job or if you lose some kind of status somehow, you know, maybe you won the lottery and it placed you in the golden triangle, that's where you live, and then something happened, some bad investment, and you don't no longer have this amount of money, and so you move downward, you know, you come down to the rest of us mortals, and that's where you live. And so you can actually fall down, you can move down, because wealth is a factor that influences social mobility in our society. Now, in some cases, pigmentocracy, that big word, pigmentocracy, sound like we're talking about pigs, not quite. When we talk about pigmentocracy, we're talking about the shading of someone's skin. You know, the extent to which you are brown or darker, you know. And so we know that in Jamaica, we have different shades, right? So we range from very, very dark to very, very light. Yes. And so you determine, people are sometimes, you know, work and so on, are determined by the shading of your skin. Yes? It was once so. Is it still so? Is pigmentocracy still a feature of Caribbean society? Did you know that one time, in order to work in the bank, you couldn't look like me to work in the bank? Not at all. I am too dark, one, and I have locks, two. I could not work in the bank, right? So in order to work in the bank at one point in Jamaica, and this was well after enslavement and well after independence too, I might add, you had to be very, very fair-skinned, and you had to, if you did not have some kind of light Indian-looking hair, you would have had to cream out your hair. You could not wear your natural hair as we are doing so and loving so much now, right? And so we are asking the question, is this still so? I mean, when you look at banks now, lots of dark-skinned people are working there with natural hair, afro, and all kinds of things. But in other sectors, is it still a factor? Can we identify any other sector of the society where pigmentocracy still is an important feature? Think about it. And then perhaps you can tell me when you send your questions in. Now, we want to examine pigmentocracy as it relates to George Beckford's plantation model. In 1983, George Beckford argued that the plantation was a total institution, and elements of this model are still evident in Caribbean society. Well, that was all the way 1983. That was before I was born. So, does it still exist? As a total institution, the plantation controlled the political, economic, and social systems. In other words, everything else had to do with the smooth running of the plantation and ensuring that sugar was planted and that the planters were making money from this planting of sugar. So people's movement were restricted. People's movements were restricted as it relates to how it affected planting of sugar, you know? And so everything that was done during the period of the actual plantation system had to do with how much of the sugar is planted and how much profit the planter could make. Monoculture, this one crop situation, just sugar alone, right? And we all know sugar cannot eat, but one crop was planted. The actual plantation may have been dismantled, but evidence exists of its continued influence in the political, economic, and social structure of post-colonial Caribbean society. Can you think of any evidence that may exist? I'm hearing you from all the way in St. Elizabeth and St. Thomas. What do you think? Do we have elements of the plantation system today? You know, it's a common saying. Sometimes you work somewhere, and just based on how maybe administration acts and so on, you say, yes, we are going to the Bakra Master plantation. You know? But does that mean that the elements of the plantation still exist? All right? So these are questions we want to ask, that we want to look at. And these are things that you will have to engage with in your writing as a student of Caribbean Studies. So we say we have the model of George Beckford's Plantation Society. We know the features of the society, and we examine the relevance in contemporary Caribbean, and of course we conclude. And this is just a general trajectory of how we would look at this issue of the plantation still as a feature in today's society. Let's move right along. Because George Beckford's theory is not the only theory that exists. That is a Caribbean theory. But we have some larger structural theories that we can look at as they relate to social stratification. Some of them are at the top of the list: Marxism, functionalism, interpretivism, and feminism. And you know, feminism, we're not going to look at all of them today. You can do your reading on them. But feminism, so very important in this system of stratification, because I don't think that we had mentioned any time previously that sex, or in some cases gender, because sex simply means biology, male or female, and gender is a larger societal construct. So perhaps we could say gender here. Gender plays a role in stratification. To what extent is this true in Caribbean society? Is it so? For some societies, it is a major, major issue. Middle Eastern societies, their stratified system is completely based on gender. Because if you are a female, then there's no way that you are able to do certain things, or certain privileges are available to you. So that is also a very important factor. But in the Caribbean, women can go to the university. They can go as high as they want to go. When we talk about education. But is it so when women actually have to now launch out into the working world and look for those top jobs? Are women getting those jobs? Yes? Good question to think about. Now, for Karl Marx, the society is divided into two social classes: bourgeois and proletariat. The bourgeois are the owners of the means of production, the people who own the businesses and so on. They are the movers and shakers in this capitalist system. And the proletariat are the workers. They don't own anything but their labor, right? And so they give their labor, and they're exploited by the bourgeois. That is what Marx says. Now, Marx saw the working class as lacking consciousness. He said they need to rise up, you know, and rebel against the bourgeois in order to ensure that there's a more egalitarian society, that all the resources of the society are shared equally for everybody who live in this society. There should be no divisioning, no inequality should exist in societies, because what it does is that it perpetrates exploitation of people. Right? And it is the stuff that racism is born of, you know? So this is what Marx says. And so communist systems, such as what exists in Cuba, is a direct offshoot of Marxist ideology. So Marx says the proletariat must rise up and overthrow the bourgeois. All right. Now, the functionalist system, it says that stratification is functional. It is functional, direct opposite of what Marx says. Can you see that? Because it encourages competition, and people don't become lazy and think, oh, I have something that is, it just falls into my lap. No. It causes people to have to work hard for what they want. It allows them to learn, to grow, and to improve, and to work hard for their standard of living. That is what functionalists say. That is important to have a stratified society, so that people don't become lazy. All right. So we have looked at some of the theories, and as I said, you need to go and do your own reading on the feminist perspective, on the interpretivist perspective, and other perspectives that exist as it relates to social stratification. And we have explored social stratification in general. And, the Caribbean theories defined the major terms and so on. So we want to pick your brain a little bit. I love to come with this brain thing, yes, because your brain must be working. So let's pick your brain just a little bit. And I want to ask you this question, a very popular past paper question. I'm sure you should know by now that you will in fact be sitting 2 papers as well as the SBA this year for your exams. And so we have to begin to see how we can interact with questions that may come on the exam as it relates to the topics we are doing. So let's look at this question. Discuss the factors that affect social mobility in the Caribbean. 20 marks. Easy cheesy. Because you do have 30-mark questions that come. And so this one is pretty simple to start off. As we go along, we may do some more difficult questions. How would you approach this question? I know you're thinking about it already. Let's look at what could be included in your response. Some of the things that you must have. You must have your background, because you must be talking about enslavement and plantation society in order to be discussing stratification. You must have your definitions of terms, stratification and mobility and some of those other terms, pigmentocracy and so on. And not just to define them, but to use them properly while you are writing. You must have your theories, your major theories, and then your Caribbean theories. Functionalism, Marxism, feminism, interpretivism, and so on. You must have those as a part of your discussion. And then, of course, you must have the factors, because that's what the question asks you for. It asks you to talk about the factors that affect social mobility. So color, wealth, education, marriage, all of those things. Race, perhaps, but we don't necessarily have an issue with race in the Caribbean in terms of social stratification and mobility now. But we do have a problem with color, and color is quite different from race. Think about it, do some reading. So that should constitute your response. Those things must be included in your response. Let me go a little bit further to explain to you some of the nuances. Let's look at the introduction. How do you write a paper, a proper structured paper for Caribbean studies? You brainstorm first of all. That's why I have my brain there. You have to brainstorm. You have to think. You have to read and you have to think. Begin to just jot down things as they come to you, ideas. And when you do this, you're not just clutching at things and just putting them into the paper as you see fit, but write down, make a plan, all right? And then you present your plan. Right? The introduction is important because it is the appetizer to the main course. Yes? So, like a nice bowl of soup or a salad. So you want to catch the examiner's eye, and you want to ensure that from the very get-go, you put yourself out there, and it shows that you know what you're talking about. All right? How do you approach the writing now after you come out of the introduction? Because for the introduction, some of the things that I named, the background and the theories and the major terminology must be coming out in your introduction. And then at the very end of your introduction, you will have your thesis statement, right? And your thesis statement says specifically what you want to posit in this paper, right? But how do you approach the rest of the writing? Here is a very good acronym you can use. PEAL, point, explanation, example, and link. So every sentence that you write from here, say you're looking at each of the factors to form your paragraphs, right? Education. You must state your point. What's the point you're making? Explain, give some more details, give some example. And the example here could be a Caribbean country, that you want to explore in terms of how this particular situation is borne out. All right? And then you want to link back to your thesis statement. So every time you write, you link back to your thesis statement. And so you continue to repeat the PEAL process all the way through until your conclusion. All right? So how do you communicate this information now? Very quickly. You use proper grammar and expression, punctuation, all of those things. No points, no bullet points. You must be writing at the CAPE level. Your spelling, all of those things must be on point. So you have to pay close attention to that. Now, just generally, because we're going to explore as we go along, how do you master the multiple choice? Now, you use the acronym READ, right? So for R, you read the question at least twice before you attempt to answer. E, you examine all the responses and eliminate the ones that are totally wrong. A, you attend to the key terms, and D, you determine the best answer based on the responses given. Now, I just want to share one question with you before we have to wrap up this lesson. Which of the following is not a characteristic of Caribbean society? We would have looked at these things, and we would have said homogeneity is the answer to that question. Now, this question gives you a statement and says you are to say which best summarizes. All right? And so the answer would be the functionalist perspective. Now, that's all we have time for today.